Ever since I started woodworking, I've been in it to make money, which is a pretty good business model if you plan to eat and stay warm at night. But recently, during a conversation with a fellow woodworking friend of mine, we got into a common theme among makers like us. It seems that after the first few projects, we often transition from creating things for ourselves to making things for others, be it for friends or family, or to customers to grow our woodworking business. This approach served me well for the first few years, allowing me to expand my workshop and invest in better tools. However, as I approached my 7th year and settle into a new home and shop, I felt a desire to shift my focus back to creating things for myself.
Bless you. Have a little sneeze? Yeah, you had a little sneeze?
Over the last couple of years, I've really begun to feel stagnant in my journey. I'd like to believe that I'm always progressing, at least a little bit, but it started to feel like I was making the same thing, or at least the same style of thing, over and over again. I really just needed a change of pace from that rustic farmhouse style that got me started on this journey. I wanted a challenge with each new project, something that, at the end of the day, when that piece leaves my shop, I have a new skill, or I've refined one at the very least. For this desk, I wanted to create something that was not only functional for me, but had the unique and soft natural edge of the slab for my top, and a rich contrast of cherry and maple for the base. Back in late 2020, I was browsing Facebook Marketplace and found a gentleman selling some shop equipment. I went to check things out the next day, and when I arrived, he also had about 20 slabs each of cherry, ash, and maple. We worked out a deal for everything that he had, and the slab that I'm using today is the last of them. It's a cherry slab that started out at just over 8 feet long and 13 inches in width at its widest sections. To maintain a uniform color and grain pattern, I cross-cut the piece in half, ripped off one of the live edges from each side, and rejoined it back together using some Titebond 3. Because I opted to skip playing this piece at the beginning of the build, I'm left with a bit of wonkiness, as I like to call it. To fix this issue, I brought the glued up top over to my CNC and installed a slab flattening bit. I started off getting one flat face and then flipped it over to get a flat and parallel face on the opposite side. While I chose a slab for its unique edges, they needed a bit of work before they could be sanded. The layer directly beneath the bark, in some cases, can be quite soft and will often come off along with the bark layer. So to avoid any issues in the future, I ground that softer layer away using a flap disc on my angle grinder. I chose to do this outdoors as it can become quite dusty in an enclosed garage. With that out of the way, I could bring the slab back inside and begin the process of getting it ready for finish. This involved a lot of planing, scraping, and sanding from 120 all the way up to 220 to make sure our finish comes out as best as possible. With that out of the way, I can set aside the top and move on to the base. I'll start by cutting down all of my parts to rough length over at the radial arm saw. The base will consist of cherry for the rails and legs, along with soft maple being used for our floating panels and drawer assembly. I'll group my parts together on the workbench and begin the milling process to take these boards from rough lumber to project-ready material. I run each piece through my jointer to get a flat face and one square edge. Then each piece can move on to the planer to get a parallel face, and over to the table saw to rip each piece to its appropriate width. In my design, I called for 2-inch thick legs, but the material I have on hand comes in at just over an inch. To achieve this, I'll glue 2 pieces of cherry together for each leg. This leaves me with material that's just over 2 inches that I can then mill down later on. I'll set these aside to dry and move on to gluing up the maple panels. My design calls for 3 of these, each of which will make up a single section of the desk that when combined gives us a space to sit and room for our bank of drawers for storage. I'll let these dry overnight, and in the meantime I can move on to our glued up legs, which are now dry. They go back over to the jointer to clean up that glue line face, and over to the planer to get a uniform thickness. For this, I'll take some measurements, ensuring that my piece is actually the size I think it is, and also to make sure I don't go below my 2-inch desired thickness. I can then take the legs over to the table saw and cut them down to their final length using my crosscut sled. Then I can move on to ripping down all of my rail and stile material to its final width, and then over to the crosscut sled again to cut them down to their final length. Back in April, I purchased this little $129 Duo Dowler jig from Amazon. Having owned a Festool domino in the past, I wanted to see how this would compare, given that it's 10 times less expensive than the domino. It certainly has its quirks, and some modifications had to be made, but overall I'm fairly pleased with it. If you'd like to see a full review of it, leave me a comment down below. To get my final dimensions for the panels, I opted to do a test assembly. I'll fit each rail component to its corresponding position on the legs and take a measurement of the space in between. I can then take the panels over to the table saw to cut them to their finished dimensions. Because the panel is made up from solid wood, it has to be able to float to allow for seasonal expansion and contraction. To accomplish this, I'll route a 1/2 inch wide groove in all my leg and rail components at 3/8 of an inch deep. The maple panels will receive a 1/2 inch rabbet around all 4 sides to allow it to freely slide in the groove that we made in the leg and rail pieces. To do this, I'll swap out my table saw blade for a dado stack and set it to the desired width. To avoid any possibility of kickback, I installed a sacrificial piece of MDF to my table saw fence and slowly raised my dado stack to clear out the material. I can then set the fence to 3/8 of an inch to match the depth of our grooves. Making my dado cuts this way not only allows me to leave the fence at a set position and run all 4 sides without the possibility of mistakes, but it's also much safer than attempting to run it with the bulk of the material between the fence and the blade. If anything should go wrong, there's nothing that's going to cause my panel to get pinched or bind between the fence and the blade. And with a panel this large, that one would for sure not be a good day. Before I glue up my leg assemblies, I'm choosing to pre-finish the maple panels to ensure that when the wood movement does happen, it doesn't reveal any unfinished portions that were inset at the time of finishing. This is a little premature at this point in the video, but it's how it happened in real time, so I just decided to throw it in here. With my pre-finished panels dry, I can begin the glue up for the leg assemblies. This is a fairly straightforward process at this stage in the game, with everything in place for this to go smoothly. Which, to my surprise, it did. I'll do this for each of the 3 leg assemblies and let them sit overnight to dry. Somehow I hit record twice when assembling this first section of the base, so I have a nice 2-second clip of nothing. But the second assembly was essentially the same process, gluing dowels into each rail piece and sliding everything together for a nice tight fit, and then clamping it up and letting it sit to dry overnight. A few months ago, I found out about a sandpaper called Serious Grit, and since then, I've replaced every disc in my shop with theirs, and it honestly makes sanding so much more enjoyable because I can get it done quicker and move on to bigger and better things. Click the link in the description below or use the code Mountain View Woodworking and save 10% off your entire order. Thank you to Serious Grit for supporting what we do. It was at this point in the build that I realized I made a mistake somewhere. I never actually test fit the top to the base, and when I did, well, I quickly worked up a plan in my head and brought in the hand tools to save the day. My solution was very simple. I'll just rip an inch or 2 off of each of the rail parts and glue it back together. I'll clean up the leg pieces with a chisel and a hand plane, drill new slots for my dowels with the doweling jig, and glue everything back together. The drawers are made up from solid maple, and each of the longer side pieces receive a rabbet in them that the shorter pieces can reference into. The drawer parts also receive a 1/4-inch groove to allow for a bottom panel to be inset. I didn't record the milling process as it's basically the same as the rest of the parts. With all of my parts ready for assembly, I'll use my go-to adhesive Titebond 3 and glue up all of the drawers. If you're enjoying this video so far and want to see more like it, it would help me out greatly if you hit that like and subscribe button, as it helps spread the video to more viewers like you. And thank you. I've never been one to care much about what I have in terms of furniture or home decor really. Even the pieces that I've built for others seem to leave my mind once they're completed. It's always been on to the next job without really giving me any opportunity to appreciate or reflect on what I had just made. But as I grow older and finish more projects and get to reflect on them, the more that I look around my home and say, where's mine? Well, here's mine. This desk represents not just the culmination of weeks of work, but it's also a tribute to the countless hours of practice, the mistakes made, and the lessons learned, and the unyielding passion that just drives me to create. It's a reminder that every project, no matter how challenging, is an opportunity for growth. Each moment, from that initial spark of inspiration to those finishing touches, is a valuable experience. It's where you discover your true potential and find the joy in the process itself. Throughout time, woodworkers, artisans, and craftsmen alike have left behind a rich tapestry of artistry. So as you engage in this timeless tradition and become part of that legacy, contributing to a narrative that transcends generations, stay humble and remember where you started.